I'll start the case streaming and let me do the recording. And
wait on. Google Chrome might not have screen recording permission on your computer.
oh, yes, you have to update that or use a different browser. That's the worst case.
System preferences.
Yes, because it's trying to be secure on your behalf.
Doing this. Okay. Sorry about this.
I don't know. It's, if anything breaks, it's usually this.
Why isn't this?
Okay, so what is it doing then?
It's not letting me modify the settings for.
Oh, worst case, I can present on your behalf.
Why isn't that letting me? Sorry.
Yeah.
Let me try one more thing. Let me try it one more time. I don't know, it's not working. So you said I can try in a different browser?
Yeah, try a different browser. Yeah, maybe you have the permissions in that browser. Or send me your slides so I can share them.
Yeah, let me just try a different browser. So I'll leave the meeting. Sorry about this, Greg.
Oh, no, sounds good. This is exactly something happens. Hey, welcome back.
Yeah. Did it again. I can't share it.
Okay, just send me the slides and you can start talking now. So reply to whenever I receive it.
Yeah. Settings for this website. Can you? Is it sharing the screen now?
Let's see. Not yet.
says given it permission, websites, meet.google.com.
Okay, and now if you press like the up arrow, can you start? Maybe you it has permission, but you have to actually do the present now button, which is this up arrow right in the middle of the bottom row.
Share the screen.
Yes, I see something. Yes,
Ah,
fantastic. Okay, cool. Hopefully you'll never have to do this again.
so, yeah,
Okay, excellent. So let me just start the recording and we'll be up and running.
okay.
Hi, everyone. I'd love to introduce Anthony Richardson from University of Queensland and CSIRO, who's been focusing on collecting and data and give us an understanding of the marine world and how do we conserve it. Welcome, Anthony.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks for the invitation to talk today. So my talk today is going to be about using optimization models and visualization tools in marine conservation. So I'm a mathematical ecologist and specialize in marine conservation. There's a whole team of us at the University of Queensland, and so I'm presenting this behalf of the team. So I'm hoping to talk a bit about marine conservation, what we're doing and how we're applying these optimization models and some of the applications that we're using. Okay, so a quick outline. I'm going to talk about the threats to marine ecosystem and what we're doing about it globally. Can explain what marine spatial planning is. I'm going to talk about R. So there's a prioritizer package that we use to run the optimization. I'll talk about the problem formulation, the objective function and constraints a bit. And then the second half will be about the real world marine spatial planning case studies. And we've developed an R Shiny app. One of the good things about using R is that you can use R Shiny. And that's been really good for stakeholder engagement. I'm going to finish on some opportunities. So it's not every day you get to talk with people at Google. So I thought I'd present some suggestions, some opportunities there. So in terms of threats in the marine system, they're increasing, and there's a number of different things happening in the threats in the ocean. So the first one there is marine aquaculture. So you can see that it's accelerated. The extraction of hydrocarbons in the ocean, the exploration of deep sea minerals. We use the ocean for desalination, finding more genetic resources, more and more shipping. So there's more and more threats and impacts on the ocean because of these human uses. So, we started on land and we have extracted and exploited most of the habitats on land, and we're moving more and more into the ocean and further offshore and exploiting fish and resources there. That has an impact on biodiversity. So here's an example from the IUCN. And here you can see that it's for sharks and rays. And this is a red list index. So looking at threatened and endangered species. And you can see that red list index has been declining. This is a proportion basically of the pristine biomass. And you can see that, a lot of these species are declining. Here's an example for coral reefs off where I am, off Queensland in Australia. This is the Great Barrier Reef. And one of the things that's happening with climate change is that there's global warming, coral bleaching, and that kills the corals. And here's an index of coral cover, how much coral is found on the Great Barrier Reef. And you can see there's a long-term decline there. And that's predominantly because of global warming and coral bleaching, but it's also because of nutrient runoff. What are we doing about it? So the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which has been ratified by countries within the United Nations. And I wanted to highlight these 4 different targets here. And so the first four, biodiversity inclusive spatial planning. So that's what I'm going to be talking about, marine spatial planning. So this applies to land and the ocean, but I'm going to be focusing on marine here. Effectively restore 30% of degraded nature. So a restoration of mangroves, for instance, effectively conserve 30% of lands and sea. So one of the aims of this biodiversity framework is called 30 by 30. So trying to protect 30% of the land and the ocean by 2030. So it's we need huge expansion in protected areas and halt human-induced extinctions. These are all the policy framework for the research that we do. And I just wanted to zoom in a little bit on target 3, which is 30% of areas are conserved. I'm just highlighting a few. It includes marine and coastal. Want to protect biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services. They need to be representative, which means we need to consider not just iconic biodiversity like whales. We need to consider all biodiversity in the oceans. It needs to be well connected, which means animals need to be able to move around. Ecosystem services is mentioned. So in the ocean, the phytoplankton, the plants in the ocean, produce half the oxygen that we breathe, produce fish that we eat, and recycle pollution, etc. And I also wanted to highlight this, we need to do all this conservation whilst ensuring sustainable use, which is things like fishing, it might be oil and gas, might be extraction of minerals or sands from the ocean, but it needs to be done in a sustainable way. I wanted to highlight one of the reasons that this is probably more difficult to expand the protected area network in the ocean than on land, and why there are more threats impacting the ocean in some ways, and it's difficult to manage. And I think a lot of it comes down to the tragedy of the commons. So 70% of the earth is ocean, most of it. And you can see in the light blue areas here, these are national jurisdictions. So these are the exclusive economic zones of nations around the world. And there's some ownership there, right? So the US EEZ is controlled by the US, but within that EEZ, no one actually owns it, no single individual. It's different than on land, where we've got property rights, so farmland or cities or property, people own those areas and then manage them. And so you can stop people coming onto your property and doing things that you don't want them to do. So within the country's EEZ, you can do that also. You can stop other countries coming in if you have reasonable governance, but it's really difficult to stop your own people, say, from fishing anywhere they like, for instance. So that governance is difficult, and it's made even more difficult in the dark blue area because these are the high seas. So no one owns them, or we own them globally. So that's really difficult to make protected areas in that area because the world has to come together, or to manage fisheries, etc. I'm going to be talking about marine spatial planning. So just to give you an idea about what that is, it's about zoning. It's like you might zone a city, right, for residential and industrial uses. Here's an example in Belgium, and there's different uses of the ocean. So there is marine protected areas, but there's also shipping routes, there's areas for renewable energy, there's areas for extraction. There's all sorts of different areas, and they all need to be, if you want to manage that in an orderly way, you need to zone the different areas. And part of that zoning needs to consider the biodiversity, and what biodiversity, basically what national parks we need in the ocean, and what other uses can go around or need to be kept out of national parks, for instance. So marine spatial planning here's the definition, and I wanted to highlight it's about minimizing, and you can see the optimization here, the minimizing conflicts between human activities and maximize benefits whilst ensuring the resilience of marine ecosystems. So it's about protecting biodiversity, but trying to minimize the conflicts with humans and maximize the benefits to people and to biodiversity. And just to highlight the optimization here. So here, I want to just give you 30 seconds to have a look at this optimization problem. So here we're trying to, each of these different A to G are different, what we would call planning units or different areas of the ocean. And you can see in each of those, they've got different biodiversity features. So corals or seagrass or fish, whale, sharks or sea turtles. And the idea here is we need to choose the fewest areas to protect. The more areas that we protect will be more expensive. You know, it might affect fishing, for instance. But we need to ensure representation. We need to get, you know, one example, at least one example of each of the different types of biodiversity there. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to have a look at how you can best solve that problem. All right, so starting now. Okay, how'd you go? So there's many different solutions, of course. Here's one, and maybe one of the first ones that you looked at. So here we can do it with 3 areas, can't we? A, B, and C, because then we get all the different types of biodiversity. But you can find a better solution than that. And that would be C and E, for instance, because you can see they're complementary, can't we? So just with 2 areas, we can get all the biodiversity. So that's sort of one of the philosophies in marine spatial planning when we're trying to conserve biodiversity is we need to take, it needs to be representative, but it also needs to be efficient.
Question.
And
To what extent are
yes,
these isolated areas? I'm thinking sharks, whales, they just go all over the world. And some, like the phytoplankton, you know, seem to stay around more or less in the same place. So how do you limit your areas?
yeah, that's a good question, Greg. So we generally use distributions of different species, and so you're right, for things that live on the bottom, they might be more sedentary, and so you protect an area, you know you're protecting that, and it's not going to move, like coral, for instance, or seagrass. But fish, some fish will stay with the coral, but other fish like tuna will move. And so when you know the distribution of tuna, you might be of a tuna species, you might be protecting 30% of the area of that species. So that doesn't mean it's going to be in that marine protected area the whole time. It will move in and out of that area. It's the same on land. You think about a national park that protects a forest, for instance, but the birds will come in and out of that forest, right? So, but there is some protection to those birds that's afforded because the forest, the habitat which those birds live in, will be protected.
Right, that makes sense.
Okay, and I just wanted to highlight this efficient part of thing, which is trying to minimize the impact on human uses. And this could be shipping or mining, could be on land, it'd be agriculture or towns, etc. But when we put protected areas somewhere, you want to minimize this impact on people. So here in white, I've got reserves, and in red, the overlap. And you can see that, you know, it's a spatial problem. So here, these are different planning units, these hexagons, and you can see the biodiversity, which we call features. And so we want to protect, again, part of all the different types of biodiversity. And you do some sort of optimization, you come up with these areas in white, but we've got these overlap areas with fishing, and people want to fish. And so, you know, the algorithm's going to try and find areas which can meet those biodiversity objectives, but don't overlap with the fishing. So we can see that some of those areas, we could move some of those marine protected areas to get, for instance, this one down here, this fish occurs up here, these biodiversity features occur here. So we could move the MPAs and so which would allow fishing if we have these MPAs in marine protected area. So we have these protected areas which stop fishing because it's a major threat to the biodiversity, but we can decide where to put them in an optimization problem to avoid the overlap with fishing as much as possible. But here we've got a sea turtle, and you look at that planning region, there's no other sea turtles here. And so what do we need to do? We actually need to move the fishing. And so that's a cost to the fishing industry when that happens. But that's sort of the basis of trying to find solutions which meet your biodiversity objectives, but minimize the cost to fishing industry or mining industry or agriculture, etc. So I just wanted to talk about this optimization problem a little bit more. So here we've got different layers, and there could be hundreds or thousands of different layers. We start with biodiversity features. These could be species like different species of corals or different species of tuna, etc., sharks. They could be habitats like corals. Biogeographic regions or habitats could be topographic features like seamounts, which harbour a lot of biodiversity. These have targets, and this target's normally a percentage of their area. So, you know, if we've got a species distribution model or a habitat model, a map of where, you know, coral reefs are on, you know, in Queensland, right, then we can use, you know, the area of the corals or the area of different species of corals or of different fish to say, all right, we want to conserve 20% or 30% of all of the area of each of those species or habitats. So that's a target. And now, you know, 30 by 30, the United Nations framework is suggesting that should be globally 30% of our oceans and on land should be in protected areas of some kind. That wouldn't mean that it all has to be locked up and not used for fishing or other human uses, but it needs to be well managed, and a lot of these areas, it will need to be protected. Okay, ecosystem services. So we can also take this into account in optimization. So we might want to maximize fish production. That might be, for instance, in mangroves, they're nursery areas for lots of fish. And so if you protect mangroves, you end up increasing your production of fish. Mangroves, seagrasses store carbon. They also protect mangroves, especially from storm surges and storms. So there's lots of ecosystem benefits, and humans get lots of benefits from biodiversity. We can also include different cost layers. So these are things that, you know, we want to avoid overlaps with fishing areas. We want to avoid overlaps with shipping or mining or oil and gas, etc. So that will benefit people if we try and select areas for conservation that try and avoid those areas that humans use a lot, as long as we can still meet our biodiversity objectives. What human uses go where? So if we generalize this idea, you can think of a more general zoning problem. So where do we put the protected areas, but also where do we put, you know, where is some of the fishing best put, and where might desalination plants, etc., be best put? Need to be connected. So, you know, coral reefs need to be connected with each other because they spawn larvae which float in the ocean. And so you find source areas. So maybe one particular coral reef supports a whole host of surrounding reefs. And so we can include that in our marine spatial plans. Climate smart. So climate change is affecting species. You know, I mentioned coral bleaching. So maybe, you know, if you have the same biodiversity in two areas and one has got a lot of you know, in the future, well, currently and in the future, we'll have lots of marine heat waves. and bleaching and the other one won't, then maybe you try and choose the area that won't have a lot of coral bleaching. And we can have constraints in this optimization problem. So there's existing protected areas, there's existing different zones that we might not be able to shift. And to solve this optimization problem, people in conservation have used a number of different tools, but at University of Queensland has developed the most common one, which is called Marxan. And that uses simulated annealing, which is provides approximate solutions, and it's quite slow to solve this optimization problem. And it's also bespoke software that you can't code in it, for instance. So it's it's an application that you run, and so you couldn't have a pipeline. So we've been using R because it's good for data wrangling. It's used a lot in ecology and conservation. You can analyze your data statistically, you can visualize it, and you can make a pipeline, which we couldn't do before in Marxan. And there's a particular package that has been developed by Jeff Hansen, which is called Prioritizer, and it uses mixed integer linear programming. So it's much quicker. It can solve the problem exactly. And we can put it's in R, so we can have a pipeline. And we can use a range of solvers. So there's commercial ones, and there's also open source solvers as well that we can use, which Marxan just use simulated annealing. And you can have alternative problem formulations. So I'll describe some of those now. So we think of an objective function, which is what we want to minimize, maximize. So the general one is we want to minimize the cost. And what I mean, that might be cost to fishing, cost to mining industry, whatever it is, cost to agriculture on land. But minimize the cost. So each of the planning units, we need to have a cost for that. And that might be, in the ocean, it is how much fish is currently harvested, the value of that fish in the ocean, because for each planning unit, because if you make that planning unit a protected area, then people are going to lose that amount of money. So we use that as the cost, but we need to minimize that cost, but whilst meeting biodiversity objectives. So the way that we do that is we have an objective function here, where xi here is a decision variable, which is, it can be 0 or 1, depending whether it's 1 is if it's in the protected area network, 0 is if it's not, C is the cost, I is all the different planning units, and we sum that, and we try and minimize that cost. So, when you select a planning unit, we're summing all those costs, and it's simply the total cost, but it's subject to a constraint of meeting all our biodiversity objectives, which is a target. So our target might be 30% of the distribution of each of the species. So this is quite a simple problem when you've got a few different features, but if you've got hundreds or thousands of different features, then it's a bit more complex. And so this constraint is about meeting your targets. Oh, all right, another objective function is we can take that cost, but we can add in fragmentation. So you can think of fragmentation is you could have different, basically the different planning units are very spread out, and maybe you want them to be more clumped, and you want them to be more clumped because it's easier to govern, and there's probably some biodiversity benefits if things are more clumped together too. So we can have a different objective function. So you can see the first part is the same. So there's the cost, but we add this fragmentation part. And this is a penalty. So B is a boundary penalty that penalizes a very spread out, with something with a very high perimeter for the total network of protected areas. So we've got this penalty for fragmentation here, and we're trying to minimize that. So we'll tend to get more clumped solutions, but we've got to tune this algorithm a bit with different boundary penalty values, and that's still subject to the same constraints of meeting your biodiversity targets. There are many other objective functions. I'm going to just talk about three. Here's another one that's quite different, which is a minimum shortfall. And that idea is that we need to meet the targets as best we can, subject to a certain budget or a certain cost. So the way this works is that we've got a weighted shortfall. So we can think of the targets we want to meet, but we can think also that maybe we can't meet those targets. So for instance, this is probably a better, subject to a certain amount of the constraints, but also the total cost within a budget. So this is more like, you know, if your mother asks you to go down to the grocery store and says, all right, these are all the previous one was, all right, these are the items on my list. Think about minimizing cost. And then just, you need to get all those items. And then how much does it cost? Here it's about, all right, I'm going to give you $20. This is my list of things. Try and get as many of those items as you can and try and meet all your targets. And so that's what this is doing here. So you end up with a shortfall from the targets often if the budget is too small in terms of, you know, if the cost is too small. And so these are different objective functions that we can use and put into Prioritizer and R and run them. So I'm going to give a few different examples or a couple of different examples now of how we've used them and then talk about an app that we've developed to do this. So on the left, just to highlight, there's different ocean depth regions or depth zones, and you know, there's a surf and different biodiversity happens in those different zones. And also there's different human uses in those, you know, there's fishing at different fishing for different species at different depths. There might be oil and gas in different places, etc. And so in this analysis, what we did was we got a cost layer. So we did this in the high seas. So that's all the ocean excluding the exclusive economic zones. And these are different depth zones here, going down from the surface to very, very deep. And these are different costs of fishing. And so, you know, it's spatially different. And so the idea is to use this minimize cost objective function to try and meet your biodiversity objectives, but to avoid those high cost areas. You can see the biodiversity as it changes, different species with different depths. And then climate change. And so there's different levels of climate change and at different depths in the ocean because the heating from where the greenhouse gases we're producing, heating the atmosphere, that's heating the surface of the ocean, it's mixed down. This is a particular index of isotherm movement. So we could combine that in an optimization and found these are areas. So we did a marine spatial plan for the different depth layers, and we used, I don't know, 50,000 planning units globally, I think, and all those different hundreds of different biodiversity and features. And what we found, or thousands, and what we found are these are the areas which were common between different layers. So we looked at the 4 pelagic layers or 4 water column layers. And so we found 12% of these areas are common throughout the water column. So if you want to make a protected area, these are the best hotspots. These are low regret areas under different climate change scenarios for the future that you'd want to protect. And if you want to protect the seafloor as well, there's some areas that are common, only 6% of the high seas, but we found areas which are best to meet your biodiversity objectives and also avoid the cost to fishing.
So question, are you
Yes.
thinking of different human activities impacting different ecosystems differently, or you're thinking, so you might allow one activity but not another activity, or is it just stay out?
And so this was just considering fishing because in the high seas, the main activity other than shipping is fishing. And shipping is one thing that it's really hard to move, right? But yeah, we were just considering fishing here. But there are other problems where you would consider more a zoning problem. And they tend to be more in the exclusive economic zones where you've got multiple human uses. Generally, in the open ocean, it's mainly fishing, and that's why we focused on that. And then the other reason here that we were focused on the high seas is that there's virtually no protection in the global high seas at the moment, because it's only last year that the United Nations has got a biodiversity treaty for the high seas, for countries to come together to make national parks in the high seas. We've never had it before that. So yeah, it's sort of timely, probably.
And when you stop fishing, presumably at the surface you have the biggest impact, but something like deep, like the lowest level, the deepest ocean, is that notably affected by fishing? Like how does that,
Yeah,
how do the different layers of the ocean affect the solution?
yeah, no, that's correct. So you do get there's more species and there's more abundance of animals and fish towards the surface. So there is less fishing deeper, but you do get fishing down thousands of meters. And what happens is that when you get deeper, there's 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 quite a lot of species that live on the sea floor. So they're quite often, so there's two sort of main types of fishing in the ocean, I suppose. There's ones in the water column and ones in the sea floor. And when you get deeper to thousands of meters, it tends to be the sea floor and seamounts, deep seamounts that fisheries will target, because there's reasonably high abundance of large cold water fish that are good eating. So yeah, we considered both those different types of fishing.
And perhaps just one more question.
Yeah.
Just looking at it seems like how do you collect the data on the abundance of species and the ecosystem health of all these layers across the ocean when it's so inaccessible?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's not what we do, but you know, and then there's on biodiversity or on fishing, and then there's different organizations and scientists that integrate them. So for instance, the fishing data globally, it really comes from FAO, which is sort of part of the United Nations, FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization. So all the fisheries data that each nation collates is sent to the FAO, and then that data is made available to scientists. So we have an idea of fishing at different on about 1,000 different species, in different depths, in different places in the ocean. For the biodiversity data, there are some different global databases supported by organizations, and quite often global organizations, that will bring together biodiversity data, and then we map them. We make species distribution and habitat models. So for instance, here we use 30,000 marine species, the distribution. And so that data set's called Aquamaps, and that's been made by scientists and made freely available to everyone. And so then we can use it in things like trying to inform marine spatial planning here. And yeah, lots of scientists make data and organizations make data freely available, which is really, really useful. And I would like to shout out that the US is particularly good at this. And so, for instance, a lot of our, sometimes we use remote sensing data, satellite, you can see the temperature of the ocean from space. And the US and Europe put up satellites and to observe the ocean and the planet, and then those data sets are usually made freely available to everyone, which is fantastic.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, and I want to show you another example, which is mangroves, more coastal. So this is on maximizing ecosystem services. So we use the minimum shortfall objective. So we want to try and meet our biodiversity targets as much as possible, but we also want to maximize ecosystem services, because mangroves are really important in terms of they bury carbon. So they bury much more. There's much more carbon that's buried per square kilometre in the ocean than there is on land, because on land, most of the carbon doesn't get buried, it gets respired by bacteria and fungi. In the ocean, sediment can fill over the carbon, and you know, for instance, in mangroves, the roots that die, it's anoxic, not much oxygen there, so that carbon is buried, and usually buried from centuries to millennia. So it's good for carbon sequestration, nursery grounds for fisheries, and for coastal protection. So we did a marine spatial plan for all the areas of mangroves globally, and then we ranked them from the areas in blue, which are the areas, the main areas we need to protect to maximize, to meet biodiversity objectives, to protect 30% of the different, the area of different species, but also to maximize ecosystem services. And then you can see the rank in the areas down to the least important areas. And we then could look at, because they're in exclusive economic zones, we could look at different countries, and we could look at, you know, the amount of money that protecting mangroves and not cutting them down, putting them in protected areas, for instance, would have a lot of benefit. For instance, here in Taiwan and in India, etc., the carbon burial would be maximally the most in Indonesia. And here's another one, fishing intensity. So the amount of fish that would be supported, and fisheries in terms of fisher days or fisher people, is, you can see, is highest in India and Indonesia. So it gives you, it was a way to highlight that when we protect biodiversity, there are ecosystem benefits and benefits to people when we do that. I wanted to sort of finish about talking about some real world applications that we've been progressing. And this has been sort of made possible because we're using R. And I show this picture because we've been doing a fair bit of work in the Southern Ocean. So we've been involved with marine spatial planning in an area called the Weddell Sea. So we were asked by the Norwegian government on behalf of CAMLR, which is 29 countries, including the EU, but US, Australia, Japan, Russia, China, etc., who manage Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. So no one actually owns Antarctica. No one actually owns the area around it either. But there's these 29 countries that collectively try and manage that for the good of humanity. And so we were asked by the Norwegian government, as part of CAMLR, to come up with a reserve network for the Weddell Sea area. And it's a large area there, as you can see, and there was all sorts of different biodiversity that we needed to consider. And, you know, a standard planning process, you need to involve stakeholders, right? And it takes months or years, because you have to, you know, talk with the stakeholders, find out what they want, go back, make your spatial plan, show it to them. They provide feedback about which features, we don't like those features in there, we want those other features, we want different targets, can you try the X and Y, etc. And it takes so long going back and forth. So we wanted to develop an app here. And so this R-Shiny app is really for real-time stakeholder engagement. So I want to, I'll just run this, if hopefully you can still see my screen.
Yep.
Excellent. So just take a few seconds to open. So we use this app in workshops with CAMLR delegates. So we had delegates from 29 nations, all using this app simultaneously to do marine spatial planning themselves and to learn about it. So I just wanted to show you quickly this, what you can do with it. So here we've got, I talked about targets. So this is the percentage area of the distribution of each feature. So here I'm going to put it to, you know, you can set it. So each delegate could run this themselves, and, you know, 30%, this is the Shiny app. These are important features. These tend to be species distributions. These tend to be representative ones, tend to be bioregions or habitats. We can have fishing here. Because of politics, we need to call it rational use instead of fishing, but this is fishing on krill, Antarctic krill, which whales eat, probably know, and toothfish, which is very valuable, large, huge fish. People could select different biodiversity features that they wanted to protect. Things you might know, different types of fish, and take them in and out. So if we untick them, then they won't be included in the planning problem, the optimization, and we can turn different representative features. We could make it climate resilient, which I won't do here, but we can run the analysis and it will run in real time. And if you do this in Markzen, as we did previously, it would take 20 minutes, 10 minutes. But doing it in R and using integer linear programming, it happens really, really quickly, and we can get a real-time solution. Here in dark blue is where the algorithm, the optimization is suggesting these are the protected areas. And we've got different tabs, so we can see, you'll notice that I set a 30% target on the features, the important features. So you can see that these dark colors are the features that were included. The ones in white weren't included. So you can see not all those, that target wasn't met. This, it's the algorithm, the individual program is meeting its objectives perfectly. It doesn't meet them for other things that aren't included in the analysis, like the Antarctic petrel. But it's still, even things that weren't included in the prioritization can still be protected because they're overlapping with it, in the area with other species, and they're found in areas that we're suggesting to protect. And so delegates could run this in real time. This was actually really good, this rational use, which is the fishing. So these areas this is for krill and toothfish. So these darker areas here are areas where there was high fishing, or they wanted to the nations wanted to fish for krill and toothfish. So you can see the solution here in this color, the darker color for the solution, where we said these are the protected areas. Try and avoid those high cost areas, but they can't always. Sometimes they have to overlap if we need to meet the biodiversity objectives. But people could run this in real time. There's a tab to compare different simulations that they ran. And so the delegates really did learn how optimization works. They learned about the trade-offs between fishing and conservation, and it really did expedite the process. So now within CAMELA, this protected area network that we've suggested has been ratified by the scientists. So it's gone through scientific steering committee, but it's being held up currently because of geopolitical tensions between the different countries, because US, Australia, China, Russia, etc. So, but anyway, we're hopeful that in the next few years this will be there will be a protected area network in the Weddell Sea, which would be fantastic.
So one challenge I think about something like this is visualizing the Perdita surface, because essentially you're having them explore the Perdita surface manually. Is there a way of summarizing it so you can kind of know where you should look for the desirable solution?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And so we haven't done that, but that is one of the plans that we are planning to do that. One of the issues is how fast this runs. And so, yeah, we've been avoiding at the moment running many solutions. But, we will be. So, for instance, you'll see that this is quite fragmented. So to improve that fragmentation, so the solution here you can see is quite fragmented. So we can set the boundary penalty, but we've got to run multiple solutions simultaneously. So that slows things down. So we are looking at solutions, and I'll come back to that a little bit at the end about how we might speed this up, and it might be something that you guys have some ideas about as well. So one of the things, once we did this app and showed the, Kamala and have shown it to other people, we had a lot of requests to do this in other areas to try and accelerate spatial planning. But one of the issues was, we initially, we're a bunch of scientists, and we made this one-off app in a single code base. We really didn't write functions to do it. It was difficult to maintain or update or generalize. So what we've done is we've moved towards, we've made several packages in R, and one of them is the spatial planner. So we took all the manipulation. So this is the underlying sort of package that we use now to produce the graphics and to do a lot of the behind the scenes work, the pre-analysis, etc. And so we've made this spatial planner, which is on GitHub. We've also made a Shiny app, a Shiny planner, which is sort of a generic app. So you can imagine that if you think about that Weddell Sea example, we had all these, distributions of different biodiversity and the different cost layers for fishing. And so, that was all pre-processed, but we'd sort of hardwired all the naming and everything in there. We've now made this Shiny Planner app, which has a config file, so you can generate an app for spatial planning based on this config file, which will set, paths, it'll set file names, it'll set background colors, it'll set the text, and there's also a dictionary that gives you a setup file, and we've got the data sets that are pre-processed, and then we can make an app for different countries or regions or whatever we're doing. And, in that config file, we can choose different objective functions. We can choose different, do we want to include climate change, and how do we do that? So we can sort of then just push a button and generate an app. So we've now got, we've been collaborating with Wait, and you guys being computer experts might have heard of Ted Wait from Gateway Computers. So he's a big philanthropist now, and one of the main things that he's been supporting is marine spatial planning for island nations around the world. And you'll see some examples of where Wait is involved in different places. And so we're trying to support that by doing the marine spatial planning, but providing an app so people in those nations can learn about marine spatial planning, learn about the trade-offs, and get different government stakeholders and industry stakeholders together to try and conserve biodiversity. So Wait has been supporting this marine spatial planning for a long time now. And so what we've made, we've actually made an app to build our apps for the different countries. So we can make an app which helps us set up the config file, etc. The data is pre-processed, so we've got to do that offline, but we can then use that app to generate specific apps in a matter of seconds for different countries. So here, Federated States of Micronesia in the Pacific, or Vanuatu, and we can then run different prioritizations bespoke for those different regions. And then Wait goes in the field and then works with stakeholders and stuff to decide on what their marine spatial planning will be. And, they run the stakeholder. We don't really get involved with that, but they run the stakeholder engagements. And, the aim is to roll this out and roll this app out in more nations to support their spatial planning. And my last slide is about sort of opportunities, and following on from the last question is here's an example of the different speeds of the different solvers. So one of the things with the app, it needs to be run quickly so people, so it can be run in real time, as you saw there. But once you get larger more planning units, bigger problem, more features, when you get more complex zoning with lots of different cost layers, different penalties. Here's a boundary penalty which determines the clumping. Things slow down. And here you can see comparison simulations, and Garobi, which we can use for free at academic institutions, is really good, but and it's faster than the other solvers that we've been using in Prioritizer. But on Shiny, we need to use an open source solver. So we've been using Symphony, and maybe that's generally slower, as you can see, compared with Garobi. And I suppose, I was just because this is a Google talk. I didn't know about the Google MIP solver, so I suppose I'm wondering whether that might be faster than Symphony and Garobi for marine spatial planning problems. I'm not sure anyone's looked at that, so that might be interesting, and that might be might help us. And I also wondered whether we're not using the cloud at all. So we're just, we're using a Shiny server, right? An Shiny server for RStudio or Posit. But yeah, I wonder whether using Google Cloud might be faster with what we're running, the problems that we're running. So anyway,
Yeah,
I'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone.
yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, certainly using the Google optimization tools would be interesting. They're all domain specific, so you never know. And whether it's a neural algorithm or classic mixed integer algorithm, it's going to vary a lot. And definitely on the cloud side, yeah, I mean, I definitely would encourage you to try looking at that, because there's many of these tools that certainly my team has been using on just running a bunch of simulations in parallel, because you want to farm it out, because you're exploring the search space, just like
Yeah,
you explore the Pareto surface. Pretty low a barrier to entry for those use cases.
yeah, yeah. It's a good point. When we haven't been doing this, so I think the optimization can't be really parallelized, but the farming out like a Pareto surface or different boundary penalties, etc., can all be farmed out in parallel. So yeah, it's a good point. So we're still sort of learning about how best to go about this.
But there's one other technology that might be just accelerate you. If you create a data set of your model, which, well, presumably one optimization. So one thing has been recently observed is some of these neural mechanisms can forecast where an optimization algorithm will go, and therefore kind of short circuit it in the easier scenarios. When it fails, it's okay, you can still run the original optimizer. But you might be able to neurally approximate the optimizer, and where it works, it'll be lightning fast. Where it doesn't work, well, you simply run the optimizer. But
Yeah.
it
Okay.
requires a lot of effort to generate a data set of the optimizer running in many cases, train a neural model on it, and then try it.
Excellent. No, I hadn't thought about that.
And actually, you have expensive. So this is very common in the expensive simulations, where you simply make a neural approximator, like basically a fancy interpolator, really,
Yeah.
for the simulation, so that 90% of the time or 99% of the time, you use that thing, not the expensive code. Much like
Yeah.
the hardcore physicists use a one-dimensional simulation when possible, two-dimensional, when needed, and 3D
Yeah.
when they have.
Excellent. Thanks. All right. Well, that's.
Well, great. Thank you very much. It was a fantastic talk. Have a great, have a great day.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Greg. Appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.